So in terms of understanding the industry, one of the models that has been around for a long time is obviously Porter, and Porter allows us to have a glance at those industry forces that will impact the organization, that will stand in the way of the organization being profitable, that essentially will give us a fairly good indication of how tough it would be to survive a particular industry. So if we look at the 5 forces, now there are a couple of things to remember. The strongest force will always be those competitors. And because those competitors aren't always obvious, it is therefore important that you properly define the industry that you're in. So the competition and the industry structure, obviously there are a number of things that we have to consider. Now, in terms of considering those, you've also have to consider the limitations. The first one is that it's great if you're looking at a strategic business unit. It's not great if you're looking at a multinational, multi-business organization. So for Tata, which is a global organization, you can't look Tata overall. You'd have to look at Tata, the vehicle manufacturer, against other vehicle manufacturers. So it doesn't work at a sort of multi-national level. It works well at a strategic business unit level. You have to realize that these are not the only forces, and that those I-spend factors will also have an impact. And the truth is that these are interrelated, that a change in one of those forces will have a knock-on effect in terms of changing others. And then I think sometimes we also must realize that what this model suggests is that everyone is out to get you, but we see in terms of modern organizations how people cooperate, how people in the same industry share technologies, how, you know, and it's not the best example because they don't exist anymore, how Mercedes-Benz launches a Bucky, which is nothing more than a Nissan Navara. I believe the new Amarok is going to be nothing more than a Ford Ranger underneath. So sometimes competitors also work together. Right, so in terms of the competition, the first one, monopoly, and we see the side effect of monopolies, in particular with Eskom. The moment you have a monopoly, competition is removed and becomes a headache. And the perfect competition where there are lots of competitors, think of the auto industry. If you think of it, and in terms of the alphabet, everything from Alpha and Audi right through to Zonda, I suppose, and everything in between. So a really highly competitive environment. In terms of perfect competition, yeah, entry into the market is relatively easily, and certainly with export and transport technologies available, the auto industry isn't that protected anymore. Innovations are difficult to protect. We also see in terms of the auto industry how innovations are shared and how sometimes suppliers actually will supply a range of brands. Profit margins are very low. So this is highly competitive. So efficiency is an important part of surviving. And then, yeah, it's about your unique market position. And that unique market position will always come back to Porter's generic stuff, whether it is going to be based on cost, whether it's going to be based on differentiation or on focus, or whatever combination of those you use. Oligopoly would be our smartphone industry and the providers of services industry. So if you think of MTN and obviously Vodacom, the two main players there. There are a couple of things that we have to look at in terms of existing competitors, and this will determine how tough it is to compete within a particular industry. We have to look at the number and size of these competitors. So if there are lots of equally sized competitors in an industry, it becomes very difficult to compete. Industry growth. So we know that, you know, industries go through those different phases, maturity and decline, obviously at the end, and introduction over here. So all of those, you have to understand where you fit in. Yeah, I am concerned about Cell-C. You know, I've never used them, but the stories aren't great. Perhaps there are Cell-C users here. Differentiation and switching costs. Again, if we look at the sort of cloud technologies that are available with Apple, Apple often locks you into their brand. So it's very difficult to move from Apple. And I know those people with Apple say rubbish, you can just easily move across to Android. Fixed costs and also perishable products. So if we have high fixed costs where you require a lot of infrastructure, very, 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 very tough to get into that industry and compete properly. And then obviously in terms of perishable products where things have to be replaced. Expansion in terms of the industry, and then exit barriers, what does it cost to leave an industry, and then obviously also the number of strategies within an industry. So if we look at the auto industry, there's so many strategies that are available, and sometimes people clearly disagree on what it takes to compete. And then just threat of new entrants. So we know that from the Chinese market, there are constantly threats of new entrants. In terms of online shopping, we know that Amazon is definitely a threat to Takealot and Loot and those kind of existing online stores. Obviously, what makes it difficult for a new entrant to get into a market is, first of all, is to get to economies of scale. So often new entrants don't have the levels of economies of scale and always take a bit to catch up. It could also cost a lot in terms of capital. So imagine Eskom someone trying to create competition for Eskom. And then also control of distribution channels. So often what brands will do is they will deal with existing retail outlets and they'll have exclusivity in terms of distribution. Good relationships between competitors, so competitors standing together to keep another competitor out. And time in terms of the experience curve. You don't just arrive in a new country and hit the ground running. It takes time to understand the lie of the land. There's a lot of learning involved in competitive advantage. And then the retaliation, what will happen when you enter the industry and existing competitors decide that they don't want you there. And then legal restraint, and you can see there is the copyright patents legislation that prevents you from operating certain legislation, keeping Eskom in power, and that's a bit of an anomaly or oxymoron there. And then differentiation, I mean, how unique and how varied are existing products in that industry. Threat of substitutes, and again, we know that substitutes is not very obvious to identify. Product for product substitution, so what we see in terms of your traditional taxis versus Uber, we can argue that that's product for product. Substitution of need when a new product renders an existing one redundant. So if you think of what apps on smartphones do and the number of things that has been rendered redundant, so think of what's happened to what Google Maps did to your traditional devices, your TomToms and those kinds of things. And then generic, your traditional GPS devices. And then generic substitution, where it's competing for disposable income. So often airtime will compete against arbitrary retailers like clothing. You know, what is the choice? Do you buy new clothes or do you spend it on airtime? And that's the reality as income reduces and obviously as the economy gets weaker. In terms of buyers, there are a couple of things that will determine how tough it is to compete from a buyer perspective. So if there are a few large consumers buying large volumes, very, very tough to compete. It gives them their bargaining power. So if you think of selling food retail type stuff and only dealing with a number of retailers, very, very difficult to compete as a supplier. Switching costs, whether people can move between products, between specific organizations. Backward vertical integration, where you take over, where the chances that people will take over their own suppliers or create their own suppliers. Purchase price to cost. So often, you know, if purchase price is a small fraction of the total costs, and quality not that important, you know, people are less likely to shop around. So again, very, very difficult to compete. And then information, and that's why, you know, people use the internet in terms of purchases. And from a bargaining power perspective, the more information customers have, obviously the easier it is for them to decide which specific product, which specific organization, store, retail outlet to use. And then bargaining power of suppliers, and you can see there, if there are only a few suppliers, those suppliers have a lot of power relative to organizations. If the switching costs are high, where essentially moving from one supplier to another requires a complete rework of the organization, those switching costs make it very difficult for a supplier to actually be divorced from. And then forward vertical integration, suppliers taking over their own intermediaries, so creating a closer link to their customers. Lack of substitutes, where there are no alternatives available, where you have to stick with a particular input into your operations. And then also depending on a single industry. So if a supplier depends on a single industry and that industry goes down, that supplier doesn't have a significant advantage. So there are a couple of things that we have to look at, and it's about using Porter's 5 forces. The first one will always be that it is a static model, and the truth is the industry structure changes all the time, and there's so many variables that have to be considered, as well as industry boundaries changing all the time. You know, in terms of the car market, if you sell SUVs, are you only concerned about SUVs, or are you concerned about other vehicles? It's that kind of industry boundary thing that becomes a headache, because we've seen the sort of X6s, etc., being introduced, and you know, where do they really fit in? And then also, you know, it assumes that organizations are selfish, and we see where competitors share technologies and work together. These forces don't impact equally. Obviously, it depends on moment in time. It depends on changes in the industry. And then, yeah, the industry environment isn't always a threat. And the basic assumption of this model is that the environment is a threat. It also ignores the human elements, and those human elements obviously add to an organization's capabilities, its ability to innovate, its ability to reinvent itself. And then, yeah, we look at a top-down view of strategy, and we know that in terms of the volatility of the environment, that it isn't always top-down, and that often we're reacting to changes rather than basing our plans on our strategic sort of forethought processes. Guys, and then also, yeah, we don't really always are able to see the line of sight between the industry and organization performance. No one's actually been able to isolate in terms of numbers and stats what that kind of effect of the industry on organizational performance is. And then, yeah, the theoretical foundation has been questioned as well. The one that's been excluded also from Porter's 5 forces, and there's a belief that this should be a 6th force, those kind of complementarities, those complementary relationships. So we've spoken about complementaries before. Remember, a complementary is something that allows you to get more out of your product or service. So a complementary in terms of your phone would be the apps that are written within its specific format. Can everyone see this? Who cannot see this slide? Can everyone see this slide? It is, you should be able to look at slide 21 on your own side, okay? So complementarities, remember those things that allow you to get more out of your product or service. And as I said, a complementary thing would be, in terms of phones, would be your apps that are written within Android, if you've got an Android phone, something that adds value to what you can get out of your product. So the kinds of things when we look at complementary relations, the first one, complemental concentration. So PlayStation 5 is only as good as the kinds of people who are writing games, the kinds of gaming houses and developers that are writing games within its format. So how many complementals are there that will support a specific brand? Switching costs, how difficult would it be to move from, for example, Xbox to PlayStation 5? It's almost impossible, I would imagine. And then unbundling complementary products, how are people able to essentially sell more and more and more? So when we think of gaming, you get the basic game, but you can always purchase the add-ons. Integration, how things link together in terms of those complementaries, and we see in terms of gaming how PlayStation 5 gives you a number of additional options. Dependence on a single industry, and we know that the gaming industry is vast, but it also competes in terms of computer gaming, etc. Visibility, and the more visible those complementals, the greater the impact that those complementals could control the market. And then market growth, and again, where are those complementals competing? If we think of the number of apps that get written and how many new apps there are and how many alternatives are created on a sort of day-to-day basis. Okay. And then industry regulation. Remember, we also see regulators playing a direct role. So what they do is they maintain barriers to entry. So these industry regulators will prevent you from essentially setting up competition for Eskom. I mean, a ridiculous idea, but it should happen. Also through price controls. So we know that petrol prices are controlled. Also direct restrictions where we have controls to look after the interests of the public. So we put these rules in place so that we prevent exploitation and we prevent harm to the public. And then also the idea of how closely an industry is watched in terms of mergers and acquisitions. In South Africa, we have the Competitions Board, and then pieces of legislation that impact the industry as well. So please look at 192.6.3. Can somebody please upload that to the group for us? It's worth looking at. And the one that we spoke about earlier is that not all competitors in an industry are out to get each other. We know that competitors work together, that we have these cooperative relationships. So competition, and it's an interesting word, is where organizations essentially in an industry work together. So when we think of organizations sharing technologies, when they share technologies, they're partners, but the moment those technologies go into their vehicle brands, they're competitors. So it's a strange thing. So if you think of the Nissan Navara or apparently the new Volkswagen Amarok, which is a Ranger, if it is a Ranger, the moment that thing appears as a Volkswagen on the floor, essentially Volkswagen is there to sell more than the Ranger option that it's based on. But before they get there, people are working together. Ford and Volkswagen are cooperating. And it's quite a strange relationship. So you can share information with buyers and suppliers. You can share resources. In the motor industry, a lot of resources being shared. Okay, you can have a glance at that.